My name is Matt. I wanted to thank you for letting me interview you. Uh, Name, please? Raine. Raine Monurvous. Pleasure to meet you. I suppose I should ask the basics first. When were you bitten? That seems like a very quick and straight to the point start. Well, in my experience, it's best to get the small things out of the way, so we can spend the majority of the time on more meaningful questions. So please, do tell me. Very well. I was bitten in 2004. I suppose I forgot to ask how old you were. If you don't mind me asking, how old were you when you were bitten? I was 24 when I was bitten. And you've been a vampire ever since? That is what happens when you transition. How did it feel? When you got turned, I mean. A lot of people claim that it's painful, but some say it's euphoric. So I never really got a definite answer from someone who genuinely experienced it. It depends on the person that's being bitten and the person biting. Some enjoy the beauty in things and get messy with it. Some like to be more soft to the touch. In my experience, I didn't feel a thing. I was in a coma when it happened. If you don't mind me asking, how did you end up in the coma? That's in the middle of the story. Shouldn't I start from the beginning? Start at the beginning then. I've got all day. I was alone most of the time. My sister and I didn't get very close. My mother was always taking care of her, and my father only cared about my successes. I studied hard, but not hard enough to get into a good college. I struggled a lot, and it made my family resent me. I was a dreamer, and I wanted to create. My father wanted me to be a businessman, but I found it boring and tedious. I wanted to get my hands dirty and make stories through color. One day, I decided to go for a walk with a suitcase full of supplies. I always carried it around with me, just in case if I wanted to capture something I found beautiful. That day, I painted a beautiful apple tree. I found it in the woods. I felt so drawn to it. The light of the sun came down, making the leaves look like they were made of gold and emeralds. The apples shined like rubies. It was the only apple tree around, and it looked magical. I sat there for 10 hours, making sure I got every detail. From the smallest emerald leaf to the shadows under the trunk of the tree. I felt at peace, felt at home. When I got back home, I was scolded. In my father's eyes, I wasted an entire day to create something unworthy of being made. He took my painting, my suitcase full of supplies, and raided my bedroom. From the smallest piece of chalk to my grand masterpieces, he took them outside. He made me watch, and he burned everything that I held dear to me. He made sure that I got the message to quit when he threw my most recent piece of artwork. I was held back by the servants, and I watched the apple tree slowly melt into ash. He made me stand there for 5 hours until the last spark went out. I couldn't take it. I shoved the servants off of me, and I ran into the forest. I heard my father yell out for me, but I dared not to look back. I felt so much pain, so much anger. I was blind until I found myself back at that apple tree. To my surprise, when my eyes cleared from tears, I realized I wasn't the only one who had found that tree. A young woman, same age as me. Her blackberry hair grew down just an inch below the shoulders. Her skin was a pale peach with icicle blue eyes, almost as clear as diamonds. She wore a beautiful black dress with red going down the middle and a single red wrist ruffle. She wore a black corset that complemented her figure as it went around her breasts and connected to the shoulders. The shoulder piece went up to her neck to give her a short collar, making it look like it was armor more than a regular corset. Her legs were covered with tights that had a darker design that made it look like her legs were wrapped in black ribbon. To pull the look together, she had leather boots that covered her calves and a leather choker with a loop similar to a dog collar. She was so beautiful. I froze and forgot why I was so emotional. While others say that their breath was taken away, my entire life felt like it had just begun. She approached me with such grace and ease, I didn't even register her hand wiping away my tears as she spoke in a voice that could only be compared to the first song of a bird chirping at dawn. She said, "The forest is too beautiful to be soaked by the sorrows of man. Smile, like it's the last smile you share." It wasn't until after I finally stopped crying when I got her name. Thistle. Thistle Gwenstock. And how did you go from meeting this mysterious woman to being bitten? Just meeting her was 6 years before being bitten. Patience. Right. I'll try my best to keep my questions to a minimum. Go on, please. After explaining what I had just gone through, Thistle was actually acknowledging me. She was holding my hand as we sat under the apple tree, rubbing her thumb against the back of my hand. My voice, once a whisper, was now finally being heard by someone who was able to finally listen. Through all of the noise of the crickets, the birds, and the sound of the leaves rustling, she chose to listen to me, a mere caterpillar who wasn't able to break the barriers of the chrysalis. She spoke to me with such honesty and compassion. "It sounds like to me that you're a bird in a cage, but you don't seem to understand that the key to break out of your cage is right next to the door. I only wish to see your artwork before you fly out of your cage." In that moment, I wanted to draw her. The way she was so graceful and caring, I wanted to capture it. But I didn't have my supplies, so I said, "I wish I could draw you, but I'm afraid I don't have anything left to do so." She was silent for a moment, just a moment, before she spoke. "You may not have the physical supplies, but you could still color me with your imagination. You don't need a pen and a paper to show something beautiful. There's different ways other than seeing beauty." Hearing those words, I knew she was right. My creativity wasn't over. In fact, it was only evolving. I explained to her what I would draw if it was her on the paper. With her permission, I positioned her on the root of the tree to the side of how my first painting of the apple tree was. I placed one of her hands on the trunk of the tree as she leaned in comfortably against it. Her legs crossed and slanted to the side. I carefully placed her free forearm onto her hip as her hand was placed loosely down to her lap. I even parted her hair slightly, so some was behind her ear, moving to the front over her shoulder, while the rest rested behind her. Once I was confident with the position, I took a few steps back and began explaining the view I saw in front of me. It may have been darker, but I spoke as if time was frozen in that moment when I painted the original. I described every color I'd use, the way the light would shine down on her to make her glow. I couldn't help but watch Thistle smile with her moist lips as I explained. Before even finishing the image, I asked, "What's making you smile like that?" She answered, "I just find it amazing that you're so passionate and intelligent that you literally painted a picture in my head. Describing everything with such ease in every detail, that's impressive. I feel sorry for your family that they can't see the beauty that I see." I was so stunned she was actually paying so much attention. It made me regret that I had to go home. I didn't have any reason to stay out that late, so I promised that I would find some way to sketch out what I saw that night, and I walked her home. Gladly, she was only 5 houses away, so it didn't take long to get her home and myself home before I got into more trouble. And did you ever sketch out what you saw that night? That night, I was beaten for running off and disobeying my father. He then locked me in my room with nothing but a mattress on the floor and an extra outfit for the next day. I was in too much pain to even look for supplies. Not that I could anyway. How long did your father keep you locked up for? We still had to keep appearances, so he let me out after breakfast was cleaned up. My father grabbed me by the hair and dragged me out to put me in an ice bath to make sure I wasn't swollen from his beatings. After 30 minutes of going back and forth from being submerged into the water and then coming up for air, I was put into the suit that was prepared for an auction. An auction? What in the world for? If I'm correct, the auction was just a meet and greet, where each family brought in the most, as others nowadays would say, show-stopping item to get rich from each other. We hosted one every month and invited only the richest in the city. So, your family put you up for auction? Like you were a mere item to be bid on? Hmm? Oh, no. My father was a private man. He wouldn't dare do anything to publicly ruin his reputation. If the other rich families knew that his only son was a failure, he'd be part of a laughing stock. Then why bring you to the auction? If you were a failure, what use would you have there? Me not being there would cause suspicion that the family was having a problem. It was on a Saturday as well, so I didn't have any reason not to be there. And this is where Thistle comes into the story again, correct? So she found me in the middle of the auction. I was sitting by my father when I heard someone hissing at me. When I turned, I saw Thistle behind a curtain, trying to get me to follow her. Of course, I was hesitant and didn't want my father to get more angry with me. She kept persisting, though. I eventually caved and whispered to my father that I needed to use the loo. He just waved his hand at me to shut up, and I ended up sneaking away to Thistle. When I asked her what she was doing there, she pointed to a suitcase. "I got you something. It's right there," she told me. When I noticed the suitcase, I went over to open it and found a new art set. It was full of pencils, paints, brushes, erasers, charcoal, everything an artist could have wished for. I was overjoyed and hugged her tightly, thanking her repeatedly. She was so happy that I liked her gift, and as my appreciation, I spent the rest of the auction sketching what I described in the previous night. While I was sketching, I asked, "I spoke a lot about my life, but I didn't get your story. Want to talk about your story while I sketch?" Her answer was, "My life isn't as important. Nothing more than boring parties and a strict lifestyle. You know what it's like." I did find it a little odd that she was so quick with her story, but I didn't question it. I didn't really care if she didn't speak about her life. I assumed it was similar to mine. Overbearing parents, hardly any relationships with anyone, pushed to be something we're not. Seemed like repeated information. So, then what happened?